My name is Carlin Borisenko, and you're listening to the Actively Unwoke podcast. If you want to find full archives of the podcast, head over to my Substack, Carlin, Karlyn, .substack.com, and make sure you're supporting the work I'm doing for $8 a month, $80 a year. You get a variety of perks when you do, to include 2 Zoom calls with me every single week, to include access to the supporter Discord, to include the Inner Circle podcast, which is my supporter-only podcast that is run through the Substack, and lots more. I really appreciate it, guys. I'm completely funded by you, and I can't do it without you. Well, this wasn't my original plan, but we need to return to the topic of James Lindsay. And I swear, this is not something that I actually take pleasure in discussing. There are many more things that I would rather be focused on. But the fact of the matter is this. James Lindsay is hugely influential in how people that are attempting to fight back against the woke less cultural revolution in this country, he has a huge influence on them in terms of how they perceive the left. Now, a very basic concept in the art of war is that if you don't understand your enemy, you can't beat them. And I'm sorry. I know there are a lot of people out there who love and respect James and everything he's done, and God knows there are things that I will never take away from him. I learned a lot from him 4 years ago. I really did. I will never take that away. However, we are in a different time, and James has now lost the plot. And I know that because yesterday, James premiered a new podcast on his New Discourses podcast titled Queer Theory is the Doctrine of a Sex-Based Cult. Now, this is his Gnostic sex cult theory, which we've discussed. I discussed it in the previous podcast. Queer theory is not a Gnostic sex cult. The very clear, stated, objectively true goal of queer theory is to abolish capitalism. The reason they want to do that is they believe capitalism creates all problems in society. When queer Marxists say normativity, they mean the capitalist system. They believe that capitalism, which is defined as private property ownership, created the gender binary, which is men and women. The gender binary is also called the patriarchy. The gender binary put men in the workplace where they were making all the money and had all the power. It put women in the home doing the unpaid labor of raising the next generation of oppressed proletarian workers, otherwise known as the nuclear family. And because of this concept called social reproduction theory, and I've covered this extensively on my YouTube channel, to a lesser extent on my Substack, but social reproduction theory is basically this idea that social systems will reproduce themselves until they are disrupted. And so because of social reproduction theory, what the left believes is that the nuclear family, which effectively was created by capitalism through the creation of the gender binary that put women in the home doing the unpaid labor of raising the next generation of proletarian workers, otherwise known as the children. Because of that, the left believes that the nuclear family is the literal means of reproduction of capitalism, and that capitalism will continue to reproduce itself until the nuclear family is disrupted. These are the goals of queer theory. These are the goals of queer Marxism. I have probably watched over 1,000 hours of queer Marxist training, queer theory, the ones that the real activists in the real world do. I probably watched over 1,000 hours of it in the past 3 years. Many people in my audience have watched just as much of it as I have. Some people in my audience have been with me since the very beginning of me starting to do these deep dives at the beginning of 2021. And so we know what queer Marxists say. We know what queer Marxists believe. I have provided ample clips of this on my Substack and my YouTube channel. And you never have to take my word for it because you can tune into basically any show I do on it. They are incredibly consistent. James Lindsay has never watched this material. Now, I used to try to send it to him. I used to slide into his DMs with it, and he would just ignore it every single time. And so then it got to the point where I was sliding into his DMs just to tell people that I sent it to him, but not actually expecting him to look at it. James Lindsay does not like primary source video evidence because primary source video evidence of what real queer Marxists are doing in the real world is deeply inconvenient to him. Because what James Lindsay is doing is he's reading the philosophy that was published decades or even centuries in some cases ago, and he's cherry picking the academic papers that are supporting the narrative that he wants to sell to people, and he's ignoring all evidence that contradict the narrative that he's trying to sell. He just ignores it. He pretends it doesn't exist. And listen, I don't make these claims lightly. Like I said, years before I started speaking up about this, I was sending him this stuff. I have the receipts of me sliding into his DM, showing him video after video after video, and him not responding and not even bothering to look at it. So we know he's not looking at it. We know he is not hinged in to what real queer Marxists are doing in the real world. But luckily, I have a community that is. Because again, we watch a lot of queer Marxist training. It is one of the staples of my channel. We watch it. We watch at least one queer Marxist training a week, and oftentimes we're watching more than one or even several queer Marxist trainings a week. We know what they're saying. They're incredibly consistent. We know what they're teaching each other. We know what they're influenced by, which, by the way, is not the philosophy as much as James Lindsay thinks it is. They are far more influenced by the queer anarchist literature than they are by the philosophy, because you know what? The queer anarchist literature, queer Marxists have an entire subculture where all they do is communicate with each other and talk to each other, and they write these anarchist zines and communiques, and they pass them around and everyone reads them. Much sexier than the philosophy. This is something I've started to cover on the Inner Circle podcast recently, where I'm actually reading the queer anarchist literature and analyzing it, because what we see in the queer anarchist literature is much more comparable to what we see the activists actually saying in the real world. Now, if James Lindsay was interested in what the truth is, this would all be really valuable information. And believe me, for a long time, I really thought that there would be a time that James would remove his head from his ass and ask to see it, because I have the largest catalog of this stuff on the internet. And it's not even close. Well, that never happened. And in fact, not only did that never happen, when my audience and I started kind of, I won't say aggressively, but we started using James's tweets as examples to teach people what queer Marxists think, which you would think James would want that, right? You would think he would want people teaching other people about what the left is doing. In fact, James flat out says this in his speeches. I've seen him do it. He did it in this podcast that we listened to. I also saw him do it at a Turning Point USA event that we watched on my channel last week, or maybe a couple weeks ago. He says, I want more people doing this. I want more people doing this. Well, I have an entire community of people who do this all day, every day. And James hates it. And when we started using his tweets to teach people what the real activists are saying in the real world, he started blocking me. He started blocking members of my community. He started not even just blocking us and being quiet about it. He would announce to his entire 500,000 followers, block these people. He would demand that they block us, to block out any dissent from what he's teaching, because what James is teaching about queer theory has nothing to do with what actual queer Marxists are doing. So my community doesn't take too kindly to this, because a lot of them are really invested in this. A lot of them dedicate a lot of time to doing this. They have watched, as many of them have watched at least over 1,000 hours of this content with me. That's not an exaggeration. And so they're bought in and they know what's going on. And a lot of them used to follow James. A lot of my community used to follow him. And maybe they found him through me, talking about him or writing about him in my book. Or maybe they found him on their own and then they found me after they found James. But a significant portion of the people who do this with me have listened to a significant amount of James Lindsay's content. Quite frankly, my community members, for the most part, have listened to more of his content than I have, by a long shot, because I stopped listening to his content about 3 years ago because I didn't want to be influenced by it. I bring all this up to give you some background, because yesterday, when James premiered his new podcast on the New Discourses YouTube channel, Queer Theory is the Doctrine of a Sex-Based Cult, we decided to do a little, well, perhaps get in a little good trouble in James's chat. And I started streaming the live premiere of the podcast. And dozens of my community members went over to James's chat, and I was explicit on this, and you can go back on the stream and watch. I told them no shit posting, no spamming, no insults. What I want you to do is just post factual information in the chat calmly. Don't argue about it. Just stick to the facts. Be even-keeled. You don't need to do anything more than that. And they did, for the most part. I'm not saying that there weren't a couple people here and there who maybe got a little uppity, but no one was actually attacking. No one was insulting. There were a couple people that were being a little bit more antagonistic than I wanted them to be, and I told them that, but I can't control what everyone does. But for the most part, people were being pretty even-keeled. And James blocked every single one of them. And I want to read you some of the things that they put in James's chat, because they are indicative of what James believes are not things that he should be questioned on. They are indicative of things that James doesn't want to speak to. They are indicative of things that James doesn't want to allow as part of the public discourse around what queer theory is. And silly me, I kind of think we're in a place that all reasonable people should be coming together to discuss these topics. I'll even toy with James's crazy Gnosticism ideas if he starts to grapple with facts and reality and what real queer Marxists are doing on the ground. I'll have that conversation, sure. But James doesn't want to have that conversation. James wants everyone to believe that queer theory is a Gnostic sex cult. Literally, he said that in the podcast. More than once, he called it a Gnostic-based cult, and he called it a sex-based cult. That is a Gnostic sex cult. James doesn't want anything in the public sphere for discussion around what the left is doing that is not directly approved by him and that does not confirm his narrative. And as someone who is an academic, James knows better than this. He knows better. So I want to read you some of the things that were put into James's chat yesterday. And you can no longer see them on James's channel because James erased all the evidence. But luckily, I streamed the whole thing live and I got the whole thing on video, so James can't actually hide from this. Here are the questions that members of my community were banned from asking. Or there are questions and then there are also statements. So let me read you some of the things that got my community members banned from New Discourses. I thought queer theory was more geared towards attacking the gender binary. Is that correct? People can look up Sophie Lewis, #1 abolish the family queer theorist and activist, and none of what she has to say has nothing to do with Gnosticism, but rather about capitalism. It's really about ultimately destroying the nuclear family. Queer theory is opposing normativity. Part of it is opposing monogamy disguised as women's sexual liberation. But that's just a small part of the whole. That's not what real socialists say when we listen to them. They believe children are private property because of parental rights. They see property as capitalism. Abolishing capitalism is their goal. Queer theory is the cohesion of everything in conflict with the heterosexual capitalist world towards the queerest insurrection, Mary Nardini Gang. Are you saying they want to abolish the gender binary or something else? So sex, as in the gender binary, is male and female? Do you know anything about the Mary Nardini Gang? Have you read Towards the Queerest Insurrection? Drag Queen Story Hour is about teaching kids that gender is performance. The Mary Nardini Gang wrote what we call the Queer Manifesto, something James hasn't read apparently. And again, nothing about kids, Gnosticism, but rather an attack on capitalism. Queer Marxists hate the gender binary because they see it as why men are the providers and women did the unpaid labor of taking care of the home and raising the kids. Are alternative forms of kinship related to abolishing the nuclear family? Because that's what queer theory wants to do. Again, all of these things I'm reading you, and I'm just scratching the surface, are things that got people banned permanently from chatting in on the New Discourses YouTube channel, which James Lindsay runs. Let's continue. When you see the words alternate modes of kinship, this is a nod to abolishing the family. Sophie Lewis, queer activist, and also a professor, knows all about this. Alternate forms of kinship is anything other than the nuclear family. Good point that it's not about gay people, but that means it's not about sexuality. It's about opposing the normativity of gender and the nuclear family, which queer theory says reproduces capitalism. Straight people can identify as queer allies because queer is a political identity, Marxism, and the struggle is against capitalism as a mean to solve the social reproduction problem. They say so. Queer is a far-left political ideology. Anyone can identify as queer. The point is to abolish the gender binary. Queer Marxists think capitalism created the gender binary. It's about abolishing normativity. They don't like homonormativity. If you watch this and did not know that queer has nothing to do with sex, that children are considered private property, the real goal of all of this is to destroy capitalism, you need to watch Dr. Carlin B. Now, I want to be very clear. I told people not to use my name in the chat because I knew that using my name would get them banned, and that wasn't the point of what we were doing. But again, I don't control everyone, and that was chatted in. I still don't think that's cause for banning someone, but maybe that's just me. Now, we're going to keep going because, again, I've got dozens of these, and I will be posting all of these screen grabs in the show notes over on the Substack, which is, again, carlin.substack.com. I believe this is going to be episode number 52. You can reference whatever it says in the podcast to find the correct one, but I will be making all this stuff available to you guys so you can see for yourself that I'm not making this up. And I just really want people to ask, James has said he wants people out there teaching like he is. He wants so many more people digging into this stuff and out there teaching and stuff like that. He said it in his speeches. He said it in his podcast. He literally has people that are clearly invested in understanding what queer theory is, that understand it to a very nuanced degree, that are putting clear information out there that is all grounded in primary source video evidence that they can show people. Why is he banning this? Why is this being banned? If James is serious when he says he wants people out there doing what he wants, 1 million people doing what he's doing, so he can go do other things, that's almost a direct quote from him, then why is he banning the people who are doing it? Let's continue. Gays are defined as homonormative. Queer theory opposes that as well because most gay people reproduce capitalism. Queer is a far-left statement that they are against the gender binary. They want to destroy the gender binary and traditional gender roles and the nuclear family to destroy capitalism. Why does the Mary Nardini gang say the goal of queer liberation is to abolish capitalism? The Mary Nardini gang, by the way, basically is responsible for this document we call the Queer Marxism Manifesto, which is towards a queerist insurrection. You can find information about this on my Substack. The reason we keep asking about this is that we've heard the Mary Nardini gang quoted on more than one occasion by actual queer Marxists in the real world, and James has never covered this because he probably doesn't even know about it because it's not in the peer-reviewed literature. Now, that doesn't mean it's not influential. It's hugely influential. We hear it coming up in trainings on a regular basis. So that's why they keep asking about this, because they know what it is, and James doesn't. Queer is about having a political identity of destroying the norms of gender and family so that they can get rid of capitalism and establish their Marxist rule. According to actual queer Marxists, normativity in a capitalist society is what creates the nuclear family, and the nuclear family is the perpetuating force of capitalism, nothing to do with Gnostics. Queer co-opted the LGBT movement and attached Marxism to it, and that's why you have the gender and sexuality being taught in schools and drag queen story hour. Queer is the defiant oppositional mechanism against capitalism, James. That's a direct quote from the Mary Nardini gang. Queer is a defiant opposition to the norm, which means Marxists, or maybe it isn't a direct quote from the Mary Nardini gang, but it was alluding to something they said, just for context on that. Queer is a defiant opposition to the norm, which to Marxists means capitalism. Queer is a defiant oppositional position against capitalism. Queer is a way... Wait, hang on. So queer is a far-left ideology, not a sex-based cult. Is queer what the encampments on universities are doing? That's actually a good question. In some ways, yeah, it is. That's another podcast for another day. What is the dominant? This all sounds very vague. Opposition to what norm? If you are talking about something that is normative, isn't that capitalism? The Mary Nardini gang has told us this by saying queer is about the annihilation of capitalism. The norms are the gender binary and the nuclear family, which are the foundations of capitalism to Marxists. The reason they do all that is to abolish capitalism. Drag Queen Story Hour is about teaching kids that gender is a performance to abolish capitalism to attack the nuclear family. It's more about focusing on the gender binary, man and woman. The reason is because queer Marxists are focused on abolishing capitalism and they think capitalism created the gender binary and the nuclear family. This sounds like a disruptive act against the horizon of possibility of a heteronormative capitalist world, open beyond the gender binary as opposed to gay and lesbian, which upholds the binary. I think that Drag Queen Story Hour is to teach kids that gender is performative, queer is political. Can someone not just declare themselves queer? Drag isn't sexual, it's about teaching kids that changing gender is the same as changing your clothes. It's about abolishing the gender binary. A professor at Yale University has told us that queer is a performance. This is because Drag Queen Story Hour is to teach young minds that the gender binary doesn't exist. Changing gender is like changing clothes. We're not even halfway done, guys. These are all things that James Lindsay banned people for the other day. Drag is a performance. They want kids to know that your gender is a performance because they want to get rid of the gender binary. Now, it might sound like I'm reading the same things over and over and over again. If you go to the Substack, you'll be able to see that these are all individual chats, but the reason that it sounds like I'm saying the same thing over and over and over again is because different people are saying roughly the same thing. And the reason that so many of my community members say the same thing is because they hear the left say this over and over and over and over and over again. People seem to have the mistaken impression that people in my community are parroting my words and I'm telling them what to say and they're going out and saying it. That's not what's happening. What's happening is we sit down, we watch the trainings, we listen very closely to the language, we listen to some of the sections of the trainings multiple times, and Marxists are incredibly consistent, so they very literally do basically say the same things over and over and over and over and over again. They might vary up a word here or there just slightly, but the themes are the same. And so you have a group of people here who has literally watched Marxist after Marxist after Marxist after Marxist after Marxist say this stuff in the real world. That's what they're repeating. It's not coming from me. It's coming from the trainings we're watching. A lot of people were correcting James about Drag Queen Story Hour. Drag Queen Story Hour, James says, is to sexualize people, but in reality, it's to teach kids that gender is a performance, that they can change as easy as changing their clothes. That went on for a while. And then a bunch of people wrote in James's chat, normativity means capitalism, which is true. We literally just reviewed, what was it? We reviewed some queer training or some queer piece of literature within the last week on my channel where they explicitly said normativity means capitalism, and I don't recall what it was off the top of my head, but that's just common sense. Every time queer Marxists are talking about abolishing capitalism, they're talking about attacking normativity. They'll do it in the same sentence. And so for them, normativity means the capitalist society fitting into the capitalist world. And so a whole bunch of people wrote normative means capitalism, normative means capitalism, normativity means capitalism. James didn't like that too much because he chatted in from the New Discourses account saying the trolls outed themselves. Now, up until this point, everyone had been, again, I'm reading the chats, you can go see the evidence for yourself. Everyone had been rather nice. No one was arguing, no one was insulting, none of that. They were just providing their perspective based on watching a lot of this stuff about what was going on. And James didn't like that. And that's when the ban hammer started really coming down. So at this point, James just started banning anyone that was saying the word capitalism. I mean, truly and sincerely. I got comments, and you can see this over on my stream of it. Like, they're deleting all the comments, they're deleting all our stuff, they're banning us. But people still were chatting in because some of my community members have multiple accounts. Here's some more stuff that got people banned from James's chat. The goal of queer theory is to abolish the gender binary and the nuclear family. It is to abolish capitalism. The goal is to destroy the family structure. They perceive the family as a cornerstone of capitalism. It has nothing to do with being gay or straight. Queer is an attack on the gender binary because it upholds capitalism, which is defined as private property ownership and includes parental rights. And you know what was so funny about this is there were actually people in James's chat who said, none of you know how to speak English. Like, they were insulting, they were saying that none of us knew how to speak English and that they were calling us socialists, which shows you how little James's audience knows. People in James's audience consistently call me a socialist, and they consistently call members of my audience socialists because they don't understand what we're saying, because James has not taught them things that are hinged into reality with what the left is doing in the real world. James's own audience, some of whom have been listening to James for literally years, cannot distinguish between people talking about what socialists believe and actually being socialist. This is mind-boggling to me. It's so clear to me. It's so clear to my audience. But if you don't know the language, which James has never taught them, then it can be very easy to get confused, and many people in James's audience are confused. Moving on, this is more stuff that got people banned in James's chat. They want to erase the gender binary altogether. The awkward children who feel like they don't fit in are not encouraged. That's just part of growing up, and it must mean they are non-binary. Isn't the point of teaching drag, teaching kids that changing gender is as easy as changing an outfit? Isn't queer theory about crushing the gender binary? Isn't that why they, them is so popular? They're teaching kids that gender doesn't exist to abolish the binary. Guys, you've got to listen to socialist and Marxist content. This will become clear. It's important to know what their views are on the gender binary. They're actually pleading with James's audience to listen to real socialists. But James doesn't want to listen to real socialists. James wants to pontificate and sell a narrative. Embodied kinship is an attack on the nuclear family. Alternate kinship means abolishing the family. A bunch of people said that. The goal of queer theory is to abolish the nuclear family, which is an attack on capitalism. Why would we want people to know that? We can describe it, though. They talk about wanting to liberate themselves from the gender binary and capitalism. Abolishing the family is about abolishing capitalism. Queer is a far-left political ideology with the stated goal of destabilizing the system by disrupting the norm. The goal is to topple capitalism. I've listened to some of those queer theorists. They talk about destroying the gender binary. And at this point, James was so upset that people were chatting in that he changed the requirements from people needing to be subscribed to his channel for 5 minutes to chat in to people now needing to be subscribed to his channel for 20 minutes to chat in, because he's trying to keep out any form of dissent at all. But people kept chatting in. What they say in their own words is their goal is to annihilate capitalism. Those gays are called homonormative because they uphold the normativity of capitalism. They want to end capitalism, which is defined as private property ownership, parental rights, individual liberties. This is what they say all the time. I think gays, like myself, uphold the gender binary, therefore I do not identify as queer. Queer is against the binary, upheld by capitalism. My queer friends hate that I'm a capitalist. And then James started talking. It was so funny. In the podcast, James started talking about how queer theory is a cult, which I actually do agree with him with. But he started talking about how cults ban all dissenting voices. Well, he himself was banning dissenting voices. And so a bunch of people chatted in, imagine banning people for pointing out the goal of queer theory is to abolish capitalism. Because James was banning everyone for saying that the goal of queer theory was to abolish capitalism. It's important to know this because of how they define capitalism, property rights, parental rights, intellectual property. These are things we should all care about. So the queer family is the alternate to the nuclear family. Struggle at the elemental household and community level is one of the core dynamics of a queer anti-capitalism. Peter Drucker, author, Gay Normality and Queer Anti-Capitalism. Starting to think that the goal of the left is to abolish private property, which to me sounds like it includes rights as well as ownership of property and the deconstruction of anything capitalist. I mean, they seem to hate capitalism and meritocracy and find that it brings inequity. And then someone chatted in, wait, I was watching and then scrolled up. Did everyone defending capitalism just get banned? Why would this author do that? That's a great question. Why is James Lindsay banning anyone who is defending capitalism? Why is that happening? And guess what? The person who asked that in James's chat actually got banned for asking that. So then not only is James banning everyone who's saying the word capitalism, he's actually banning people who are saying, why are you banning people for saying the word capitalism? One of my audience members commented back in my chat, he said cults isolate people and ban dissent. The lack of self-awareness is insane. And it keeps going. I think it's helpful when discussing the topic to read up on queer Marxists and books they've written. Here is an example. Sophie Lewis, Abolish the Family, a manifesto for care and liberation. Here is another example. Jules Gill Peterson, Histories of the Transgender Child. They do not like the nuclear family, that's for sure. So all the people chiming in that it's about capitalism are right. So the cult decides who can speak and who can't. Silencing is how you control your opposition then. Someone chatted in ironically. James, is that why you like banning everyone who says capitalism in your chat? James, is that like banning anyone who says capitalism in your chat? Because again, James was talking about cults and how they ban dissent, while James was literally banning dissent in his chat. To teach that gender is performative to destroy the binary. Why is it most important to teach children that gender is a performance? Here's another intriguing queer Marxist to think about, Emmy O'Brien, Family Abolition, Capitalism, and the Communization of Care. Emmy O'Brien and Judith Butler have the same ideology because James was talking about Judith Butler. I'm pretty certain the only possible goal could be the abolition of the gender binary, which is basically the same as capitalism, which the left defines as private property ownership. It's about teaching kids that gender is a performance to abolish the binary. If they believe gender is strictly performative, this behavior makes sense. Mystic sex cults don't make any sense. They teach kids that gender is a performance early. Gender needs to be a performance so that it can abolish the binary man and woman. If there is a reasoning behind everything they do. And then we reach the end of the podcast. And, I think that we were pretty well behaved up until the very end. Even while James was blocking everyone. Even while people in James's chat were insulting us. Even when all that was happening. The people that were there, and again, you can see for yourself, I put the video recording of this in the show notes so you can go back and watch the full video recording. You can see the chat. We're not hiding anything. We're not deleting anything. There were some things that were a little bit too antagonistic for my personal taste. I will offer that. But for the most part, people were pretty even-keeled, and they said what they wanted to say. They gave out good information. It was all factually grounded in primary source video evidence. I feel confident of that. And then at the end, they got a little trolly, okay? They did. And we all decided to do a grand finale. Well, everyone that wasn't banned, because most of the people at this point were actually permanently banned from James's chat. But we still had some people who weren't banned, or they had another alternative account that they had logged in with, or things like that. And so we decided to do a grand finale of everyone putting "say capitalism" in James's chat at the same time. And James really didn't like this. And this was honestly pretty great. And I have a specific clip of this that I will put in the show notes for people to watch if they want to. But this was honestly pretty great. And we, I think, did a really good job overall of articulating our perspective and how we're different than James. Now, you won't find any of this in the New Discourses chat today for this podcast. Because James deleted all of it. Because James does not want any scrutiny of his ideas. And in fact, someone said to me, well, Carlin, don't you realize that James thinks you're struggle sessioning him? Well, what does that mean exactly? Because James is an academic. James is a PhD. Does James believe that anyone questioning his ideas is struggle sessioning him? I don't think that's reasonable. Well, I mean, it is reasonable if you want to create a safe space for yourself to say whatever it is you want to say without scrutiny. And maybe that's really what we're talking about here. Maybe what we're really talking about is that James Lindsay wants to be able to say whatever he wants to, regardless of if it is hinged into reality or just made up fantasy. He wants to be able to say whatever he wants to without any scrutiny at all. And any scrutiny that comes along, he says, "You're struggle sessioning me." And that's his excuse for banning it and not interacting with it at all. I'm sorry, I don't accept that. It's not intellectually honest. And this entire strategy is just meant to advance a narrative that is not hinged into reality, is not reflected in the real world, is not related to what the actual attacks on parental rights are coming from. And that, to me, is actually the most important thing. I've said this a million times. People are like, why are you going after James? Why are you going after James? Well, I firmly believe that what James is doing is going to result in people getting their kids taken away from them unnecessarily. I firmly believe that what James is doing in terms of advancing this Gnostic sex cult conspiracy is completely counterproductive to solving any problems. In fact, not only is it counterproductive to solving the problem, it's actually going to make the problem worse. James's ideas come off as crazy, but they're the type of crazy that appeal to a very specific type of person on the political right, the QAnon mom. I think if I were to guess, and I'm just making this up so I could very well be wrong, I think there is probably a big overlap between the QAnon moms, the people who got obsessed with QAnon back when Trump was in office, and were doing all this conspiracy theory stuff to uncover like these dens of Satan worshipers and like all this crazy stuff. But there were a lot of people involved in that, and there were a lot of people who were sucked into it. And I bet you there is a big overlap between the QAnon mom and the same people who are like the Moms for Liberty crowd. And this is not a drag on normal people in Moms for Liberty. If you're just a normal person and you're like, I'm in Moms for Liberty and all we do is go to school board meetings, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the national influencers that are associated with this, because universally they're all the same. So normal parents who are just trying to do stuff in the real world, fine. My beef is not with you. My beef is with people like James Lindsay's best friend, Lisa Logan, who is advancing a literal conspiracy theory that James is selling to his 500,000 followers about Oprah pushing a Gnostic sex cult on the masses. Now, let me, for all you normal people that just want to go to school board meetings and show up for your kids, how do you think it would go over if you went into a school board meeting and said, the reason you're trying to trans my kid is because Oprah introduced a Gnostic sex cult conspiracy theory to the United States? Does that sound crazy to you? It sounds crazy to me. But that is quite literally what Lisa Logan is saying, and that is quite literally what James Lindsay is co-signing, and it is not grounded in reality at all. They are ignoring all primary source evidence that comes from the real world. And not only are they ignoring it, they're being incredibly self-righteous and proud of themselves. They're trying to discredit me. They're trying to tell people to block my audience, when all we're doing is giving out real information. I am aware that some people might find this little feud to be distasteful, but what would you do if you were in my shoes? Where I have more primary source video evidence of what's going on in the real world than literally anyone in the country. If you think someone has more than me, tell me who they are. Fact check me. But until someone does, I have more evidence from Marxist activist trainings in the real world than anyone else in the country. I have watched more of this content than any non-leftist in the world. I know what's going on. I know what they're teaching. I've been undercover at their events. And I'm watching James Lindsay, who I used to respect to a very tremendous degree. I'm watching him spiral into insanity. And not only is he spiraling into insanity, he is taking a ton of people with him. And it is all a giant distraction to actually fighting back against the left. And it's all to make money by advancing a political narrative that is not hinged into reality. What would you do if you were me? I know that not all of you have been on this journey with me over the past several years. I know all of you maybe check in with my content once in a while, but you don't sit there and watch it with some of the more hardcore viewers of my content. I get that. I really do. But I can't sit back and say nothing just because you don't want to see infighting. I'm sorry, this is way beyond infighting. James Lindsay is lying to millions of people. Why don't people find this offensive? He's lying to millions of people. The evidence is all right there. You don't need to take my word for it. You don't have to like my tone. You don't have to like my disposition. You can think I'm the bitch of the internet. That's fine. None of that changes what the video evidence actually says. And none of that changes that my audience went into James Lindsay's chat yesterday and knew more about queer theory and queer Marxism than anyone in James's audience. And James had a choice. He doesn't have this choice anymore, but he used to have a choice. James could have found a way to work with us. James could have said, okay, what do you guys know? And let's put that up against what I believe is happening, and let's build a bigger picture here. James could have done that. Up until a couple months ago, I would have been more than willing. I'm not willing to now. People might judge me for that, but unless there is a huge mea culpa on the part of James, and I don't think that's ever going to happen, I am unwilling. Because if he can't admit that something has gone wrong in his assessment, then me interacting with him would be a giant waste of time. The only value that we get from interacting with him is the ability to reach his audience and to tell his audience what is going on and to give clear, concise language and definitions around things that James is not giving. And this isn't the last war, because you can always create another YouTube account. James can keep banning people. We'll just keep creating accounts. Not saying we're going to show up for every live stream he does, because that would be a lot, but we'll show up when we need to. We might even show up to his events, ask him questions here and there. James would have much more of a problem banning people at his in-person events from asking a question that he finds inconvenient. And he should be brought to task to answer for this. He absolutely should be. There is no reason why he is not doing this. There's no reason why he's not hinging into reality. There's no reason why he's ignoring mountains of evidence that is right there, right in front of him, free to use, free to look into. There's no reason for this. And people need to be aware, and they need to face reality. And if they don't want to do that, then I suppose they get what they get. All right, guys, I've gone on way longer than I normally do. Thank you for bearing with me. Again, if you want to see the receipts of all of this, they are in the show notes over on the Substack, carlin.substack.com. Click the podcast link in the upper menu, and I believe this is going to be episode number 52. Thank you guys for supporting the work I'm doing. I really do appreciate it. I'll see you soon.